Good evening in Seoul and good morning in the United States. My name is John Park and I'm the director of the Korea Project at the Harvard Belfer Center. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to our KF Harvard Belfer Center virtual dialogue. The game plan today is to examine the long-term geopolitical and geoeconomic implications of COVID-19 on global governance. I'm very honored to have a roster of speakers who bring a combination of practitioner experience in government, as well as research and academia. To kick us off, I'd like to turn it over to Aditi Kumar, the Executive Director of the Harvard Belfer Center. And then after her, I will introduce Dr. Iga. A very quick note on Aditi's background. She worked in government in the Treasury Department, looking at a lot of the issues related to economic and financial issues, and broadly looks at the intersection of national security. She is the new head of the Economic Diplomacy Initiative at the Belfer Center. And without further ado, I turn it over to Aditi. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good morning and good evening. We are proud to partner with the Korea Foundation in further growing Korean policy studies at Harvard. KF is a world-class organization advancing Korean security studies in the United States. I would like to personally welcome Dr. Lee Gun, the president of the Korea Foundation. Under the excellent leadership of Dr. John Park, the Belfer Center's Korea program is spearheading efforts to grow Korean policy studies at Harvard. We convene the annual Harvard Korean Security Summit, which brings together leading scholars and practitioners from around the world. We also run a senior level speaker series during the academic year, which creates unique opportunities for Harvard faculty, researchers, and students to interact directly with leading officials. Past speakers have included UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, General Vincent Brooks, Korean Foreign Minister Yoon Young-kwan, and Ambassador Kathleen Stephens. First and foremost, the Belfer Center and the Harvard Kennedy School are educational institutions, training the next generation of policymakers. Dr. Park is one of our most sought-after mentors, and our Korean Studies program is a hub at the Belfer Center for student-driven research. Today, we are convening to discuss the policy challenge foremost in everyone's minds, the global response to COVID-19. Here at the Belfer Center, our scholars are contributing cutting-edge research and policy recommendations on COVID-19 across 4 fronts. The first is public health. Our technology and public purpose project, led by Center Director Secretary Ash Carter, recently released a report on the ethical innovations around biomedical innovation. They drew on historical examples such as the HIV/AIDS crisis to warn of the public harms created by lax standards for diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. Even as we race to develop antibody tests and new vaccine candidates for COVID-19, we cannot compromise on the oversight processes that guarantee the safety and efficacy of these solutions. A second line of research relates to the economic impacts of the pandemic. Belfer-affiliated economists, including Carmen Reinhart, the newly appointed chief economist at the World Bank, are studying the impacts of the virus on developed and emerging economies. Dr. Reinhart has recently talked about the importance of suspending debt payments to keep emerging economies solvent through this crisis. The third line of research relates to the cyber and digital realms. Our Belfer Center colleagues are investigating the digital solutions that are required for governments to deliver services and for citizens to have access to education and work opportunities in this unprecedented time. Our recent work investigates the role of digital currencies, for example, to bridge the gaps in financial inclusion and access, and at least in the near term, to ensure that individuals and businesses receive the stimulus payments they need to make it through this period of frozen economic activity. And finally, in keeping with today's theme, the Belfer Center is researching global governance and leadership in the time of COVID-19. We are investigating the global trends towards competition rather than cooperation, while we advocate strenuously for the latter. In particular, the Belfer Center, with our mix of academic scholars and policymakers, are pushing for a more engaged United States of America that works with South Korea, along with our other allies and partners in South and East Asia, in Europe, and around the world to stem the spread of disease and its economic fallout. We welcome the dialogue today between the Korea Foundation and Harvard's Belfer Center as an important contribution to the global governance challenge in the time of COVID-19. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished speakers and guests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aditi, for your welcoming remarks. I'd like now to turn it to Dr. Egan. Dr. Egan was the professor of international politics at the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University, where he was also vice dean of GSIS and also dean of the Office of International Affairs at Seoul National University. He currently serves as the president of the Korea Foundation. In that capacity, is initiating a lot of new programs and a lot of very exciting overall events as we see today with the virtual dialogue series. We are the third in a global series. Now I turn it over to Dr. Dr.
Thank you, John. Dear colleagues and friends all over the world, as president of the Korea Foundation, it is my privilege to welcome you all to the KF Harvard Belfer Center Virtual Dialogue. Esteemed Professor Nai, Professor Yoon, and Professor Lee, and Dr. Smart, who is supposed to join us later. And thank you for being with us today to share your insights and vision. I forgot to mention Director Kumar. Director Kumar and Dr. Park from the Belfer Center, I appreciate your devotion and passion in making this dialogue happen. The Korea Foundation is proud to have launched the KF Virtual Dialogue Series in partnership with world-renowned organizations from 6 different countries. Under the theme of COVID-19, challenges and opportunities, the series explores possibilities for the future as we witness and respond to the challenges of the current pandemic. We aim to bring together diverse views and voices to discuss how COVID-19 has changed our world and what lies ahead. Our first dialogue was held with the Asia Society Switzerland, and our second with the Russia International Affairs Council. And today's dialogue is co-hosted with Harvard's Belfer Center, and the topic is Reassessing Global Governance. Specifically, we hope to forecast and analyze the pandemic's impact on international politics and economy. Distinguished speakers, dear colleagues and friends, we are currently witnessing a major turning point in the global order. But at this crucial moment, the response of global leadership has fallen short. As borders close, international cooperation is hard to find. Each nation has been left to take on an increased responsibility to protect its own people. Countries are increasingly being judged by new criteria, their ability to respond to crises and maintain social safety against pandemics. This has created concerns about the so-called smart big government. Some people believe that COVID-19 will lead to stronger localization as globalization retreats. However, as countries across the world are already interconnected in every field imaginable, it is in every nation's interest to return to a safe, stable form of globalization. International solidarity and collaboration will also help us successfully deal with the current pandemic. It is under these circumstances that I'd like for us to ask, how can countries cooperate to help mitigate COVID-19's potential to reverse globalization? It is clear that COVID-19 has indeed created a great number of challenges. However, I strongly believe that the problems we are facing may be solved through strengthened international cooperation. Cutting ties and reversing globalization cannot be the answer. Now more than ever, there is an urgent need for the global community to work together. We must cooperatively tackle not only the pandemic, but also other global concerns, including environmental, financial, and digital issues. Going forward, a collaborative effort of global governance that incorporates universal values will be key to successfully dealing with these challenges. At this moment, our most critical task is finding a way to proactively respond to the new normal while remaining flexible, integrated, and competitive. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, I hope that today's dialogue can lead to productive discussions and suggestions about how we can collectively respond to the changes we face. We are lucky to have an extraordinary array of invited speakers with us to cover a variety of topics and share their insights, insightful ideas. On behalf of the Korea Foundation, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Belfer Center at Harvard University for co-organizing this dialogue, and to all our invited experts and guests for coming together here and now. Through cooperative efforts like today's dialogue, I'm certain we can turn the challenges of COVID-19 into opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yi. I'd like to now turn to give you a quick preview of the game plan for today with our two panels. On the first panel, we'll be examining the geopolitical implications. And as our two speakers, we have Professor Joseph Nye and Professor Yun-Young Kwan. Professor Joseph Nye is the Distinguished University Professor Emeritus at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Nye has served in a number of senior government positions at the State Department, at the Pentagon, and also at the National Intelligence Council, where he was chairman. His most recent book includes Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. Professor Yun-Young Kwan was the former foreign minister of South Korea and is also the Professor of International Relations Emeritus at Seoul National University. He is a noted author looking at a number of the issues related to nuclear diplomacy with North Korea and the geopolitical issues related to the Korean Peninsula. We'll start off with Professor Nye, turn it over to Professor Yun, and then we'll commence a Q&A session. I direct the audience's attention to the part of the YouTube live channel where you'll be able to post your questions. We'll be monitoring those questions quite actively, and within the Q&A session, we'll look to group some of these as well. Without further ado, it's my honor to turn it over to Professor Nye. Thank you very much, Professor Nye.
It's a pleasure to join this group convened by the Korea Foundation and the Belfer Center to try to understand the nature of the geopolitical significance of the COVID-19 crisis that we're undergoing. I'm pleased to have such distinguished fellow panelists and looking forward to the discussions that they will have. I should start by saying that as we look at the issue of the implications or the effects of this current crisis, we should start with humility. There are three reasons to be humble. First of all, the virus itself. It's a new coronavirus, and we don't know a lot about it. For example, we don't know whether it is going to be seasonable, whether it'll go away in summer or with heat and humidity, as some flus do. We don't know what can be done with a vaccine, and if there's a vaccination, how long will it last? Is it going to be like flu or like polio? So there's a lot we don't know about the virus. We also don't know a lot about the economic effects. We do know that the virus has caused a severe economic recession, perhaps depression. And we also know that when you have unemployment over 15%, as we have now in the US, that it's unlikely to be a quick recovery. Some economists think there might be a V-shaped recovery. Others, though, expect that it's more like a prolonged U or a slow recovery. What we do know is that if you have a deep depression of prolonged nature, it's likely to have major political effects. But as I said, at this stage, we don't know that yet. The third reason to be humble is that we're still in the early stages of this particular epidemic. And we don't know the future shape of it. It's like going to a theater play in which we're in Act 1, but we know that there will be 3 acts or 4 acts in the play. For example, in 1918, the influenza epidemic created enormous death, but more people died in the epidemic than died from all of World War I, despite its horrors. What we do know is that the first episode in 1918, the spring of 1918, killed fewer people than the return of the flu in the fall of 1918 and the early part of 1919. So as I said, if you're in Act 1, you have to be careful about trying to understand how the play is actually going to end. With that said, it's also worth being careful about the proposition that because this is a large dramatic event, it's going to have long-term dramatic consequences. Sometimes small causes have big effects and big causes have small effects. To take the case of 1918 again, what's remarkable is that the pandemic did not seem to have major effects on the politics, domestic or international, of the 1920s or 30s. There were major changes in the 20s and 30s, but they're generally associated with the effects of World War I, not of the pandemic. So we don't know a lot, and we have to be cautious. With that careful preparation of what I'm going to say, let me speculate on the question of whether we're at a geopolitical turning point. Some people say that yes, that this is a major turning point in world history. Other people say no. I tend to be more in that second point of a second school of thought that says no. But again, as I mentioned in starting, I say this with low confidence in my judgments because of the fact there's so much that we don't know. But for those people who think that it's a major turning point, they say that China is going to use this to pass the United States, become the world's leading power. And they point to the China's current efforts to generate soft power with its so-called mask diplomacy as an illustration of China getting ahead, particularly given the clumsiness of the Trump administration in terms of its international diplomacy. I don't buy that point of view. I think both the United States and China were damaged by their initial responses to the coronavirus, damaged both economically and politically. In that sense, I think it's a pity because both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump started with denial and then turned to shifting blame and trying to substitute propaganda for international cooperation. And I think this has hurt the soft power of both countries, as well as the recession that we're seeing hurting both economies. I don't think that we're going to see a change in the relative position of the United States and China. For one thing, the various dimensions of power change relatively slowly, not in just a few years. The United States military budget is 3 times that of China, and the Americans have global reach militarily that China doesn't have. It's hard to see that changing quickly. Similarly, China's economy, while it's been growing up until recently, is about 2/3 of the American economy as measured in exchange rates, which is a much more accurate way of judging international power than the artificial purchasing power parity measures that some economists use. And the third dimension of power, in addition to military and economic power, is soft power, the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than through coercion or payment. And there, the US has been hurt in its soft power by the nature of its response, but it still started off well ahead of China. The Power 30 Index, which is published in London every year, for example, ranks China number 27 of the 30 countries surveyed, and it ranks the United States usually in the top 5 or so. So I think the change in relative positions as a result of the COVID pandemic is not likely. In addition to that, I think the US has certain power advantages which are likely to persist beyond the COVID epidemic. In geography, the United States is surrounded by two oceans, which is a very great benefit. China, of course, has long borders and territorial disputes with many of its neighbors. The U.S. only has two neighbors, and they're both relatively friendly, and there are no territorial disputes. Similarly, in terms of demography, the United States has a growing labor force. China's labor force peaked in 2015, and many times Chinese will say, we fear that we'll grow old before we grow rich. In terms of energy, the United States, because of the shale revolution, is largely self-sufficient in terms of energy. And China, of course, is increasingly dependent on imported energy, including oil from the Middle East, which has to traverse the Straits of Hormuz and the Indian Ocean, where shipping is vulnerable. And in terms of financial resources, the United States dollar remains preeminent. There are many claims that yuan will replace the dollar, but until China has deep and fluid capital markets and a rule of law, the dollar will still remain the dominant store of value. And then in terms of technology, while China has made major improvements, the US is still generally seen as leading in biotechnology and nanotechnology and in the next generation of information technology. So I think in that sense, these are features of the US position, which are likely to persist after the pandemic, whatever the after means in terms of a few years or more. In that sense, my view as to whether this is a turning point in world history is no, if by that you mean that China surges ahead of the United States. I think instead what you're going to see is the major negative effects of this pandemic are likely to accelerate and reinforce pre-existing conditions and trends, not always very happy ones. For example, there was some degree of decoupling between the United States and China and loss of economic globalization even before the pandemic. I think this has been increased by the pandemic. Not that it will end, but it will be diminished. Secondly, US-China relations were already on a downward trend before the pandemic, but I think the effects of the pandemic have accentuated those bad relations. And third, I think you've seen a number of new authoritarian governments around the world. Many people mentioned the Orban regime in Hungary, for example. This antedated the pandemic, but what we do know is that many authoritarians around the world have used the excuse of fighting the pandemic to increase their authoritarian control of their societies. So those were pre-existing trends, not happy ones, but that are, I think, going to be accentuated by the crisis. However, let me make clear that we should not overread these changes. Some people say that the responses of governments to the pandemic show that authoritarians are prevailing over democracies and that democracies cannot govern. I think that's wrong. Some of the most successful countries in terms of the response to the pandemic have been countries like New Zealand and South Korea, both of them notable democracies. Similarly, I think the people who say that this is the end of globalization, the final nail in the coffin of globalization, are exaggerating. Yes, as I said a minute ago, there'll be less economic globalization than there was, but it's not going to all go away. And there's another type of globalization which is ecological globalization. So you find that pandemics themselves, which spread across continents without paying attention to borders, and climate change are ecological forces of globalization, which obey the laws of biology and physics, not political tariffs or barriers. And those are going to increase. So we may, in fact, not see the end of globalization, but an increase of some of the less fortunate types of globalization. So to conclude, I would say that we're much too early to know the full effects of the pandemic on geopolitics, but I would warn against exaggerated conclusions at a time when there's so much that is still uncertain. So I would argue that if you really were to ask what could transform the world, it would be if the US were to take the type of leadership that it took with the Marshall Plan after World War II and define our national interest as helping others, particularly poor countries, to deal with the crisis. I argue for this in my new book, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. The fact that the United States defined its national interest as helping Europe and helping itself at the same time made a huge difference. Unfortunately, what we find in the current leadership is that we're defining our national interests very narrowly, and that that means that we are failing that opportunity. So in that sense, I think it's possible that you could imagine a new American administration changing the American position on this, and that might indeed be a chance to change world politics. But frankly, at this stage, I think of the two schools of thought, that it's a turning point or that it's a accentuation of existing trends, I fear that what we're seeing is the accentuation of existing trends. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing what my fellow panelists have to say.
President, thank you very much for your kickoff remarks there. We're experiencing a bit of technical difficulty, but thank you for sticking with that. We'll revisit during the Q&A. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Minister Yoon for his remarks. Minister Yoon, thank you.
It's my great pleasure to participate in this meaningful and timely dialogue. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee Geun, President of Korea Foundation, and Executive Director Aditi Kumar, and Dr. John Park of Harvard Belfer Center for organizing this dialogue and inviting me. It is also my special privilege to share this panel with distinguished scholar and practitioner, Professor Joseph Nye. The question this dialogue is posing is, what are the long-term geopolitical and geoeconomic implications of COVID-19 for global governance? There may be many ways of answering this question, but I'd like to attract your attention to two long-term structural changes occurring in the last 40 years in international as well as domestic political economy. One is increasing economic inequality domestically, and the other is narrowing power gap between the United States and China at international level. And I think the simultaneous development of these two trends and combination of these two trends made COVID-19 and economic crisis the facilitator of a fundamental transformation of world order rather than a temporary disruption. First, as you remember, the 1980s was a period when neoliberalism replaced Keynesianism as the mainstream economic doctrine. By the 1970s, the Western advanced, capitalist countries faced serious problems like rampant inflation and increasing unemployment. In contrast to Keynesianism, which highlighted the active role of the state in the market, neoliberalism emphasized the rationality of free market and deregulation. And Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and President Ronald Reagan were the first practitioners of this economic doctrine. One interesting thing is what happened to income distribution. As you can see in this graph, the share of US income that goes to top 10% was about 40% before the New Deal in the 1930s. However, it was significantly reduced to the level of about 33 or 34% during the period of Keynesian economic policies. But since the 1980s, the share began to increase up to more than 50% in 2012 during the period of neoliberalist economic policies. The problem was the Western democracies could not successfully mitigate political, social, and economic difficulties of dislocated, especially blue-collar workers, by strengthening social safety net, by providing job training, or providing them a new jobs. And Western democracies, couldn't accomplish that kind of stabilizing role in domestic society, and political leaders tended to utilize the anger of these people to get elected. Especially since the 2008 financial crisis, socio-economic discontents rose up and gave birth to populism and authoritarianism in many parts of the world. And those leaders tended to pick up an easier choice, that is, finding the target abroad, than trying to reform domestic policies and institutions to fix the problems. They then adopted protectionist and anti-globalization policies. I think the 2020s will mark an inflection point of historic transformation of political economy like the 1930s and the 1970s. This time, a transformation from neoliberalism to a new economic doctrine. Though we are not sure yet what kind of the state-market relationship the new doctrine will embrace, certain trends have already begun to appear, such as increasing role of a stronger role of state in the market, and increasing protectionism, decoupling, etc. In a nutshell, the current form of capitalism, that is neoliberalism, is being pressured hard to go through the process of self-reform. The COVID-19 has amplified the problem of economic inequality as we are witnessing these days. After the COVID-19 crisis and severe economic recession, the problem of inequality will worsen. This will make it even more difficult for the political leaders to persuade their constituents to return to liberal international order based on globalization. This is why I think we are facing a fundamental transformation of global order. To make matters even more complicated, this domestic trend of increasing inequality coincided with another trend of narrowing power gap between the United States and China. You can see this trend clearly in this table. Yes. And if you see this trend, the power gap narrowed between the China and the United States in terms of GDP comparison. I think the US will continue to have advantages over China in terms of capabilities for some time to come. The real problem, I think, was not the decline of relative US capabilities, but China's having become too confident too soon. For example, after carefully watching the 2008 financial crisis occurring in the United States, the Chinese leaders shifted from Deng Xiaoping's famous dictum, hide your capacities and bide your time, to an assertive, high-profile foreign policy. Furthermore, President Xi Jinping strengthened the authoritarian rule while making not much progress in fixing the problems of unfair trade practices. This made the American people and American policymakers disappointed and give up their expectation about the convergence of Chinese values, institutions, and practices to more liberal and democratic values. And then the Trump administration started a more confrontational China policy of decoupling. COVID-19 crisis has amplified the worsening US-China relationship. After suppressing the first round of coronavirus in China, Chinese leaders began to engage in active propaganda campaign promoting Chinese authoritarian model and providing health and medical aid to many countries. There were exchange of harsh rhetoric on the origin of the COVID-19 between the US and China recently, and the process of decoupling is being accelerated. Again, this makes the change occurring in the global political economy a fundamental transformation rather than a temporary disruption. Economic decoupling is harmful not only from a short-term economic perspective, but also from a long-term political perspective. For example, it led to military conflicts in the late 1930s. Unfortunately, the US and China seem to be entering the period of new Cold War. Even if Mr. Biden is elected as the next US president, the essence of anti-China policy may remain the same. though there may be more room for cooperation on the global issues. Whether the leaders of the US and China will be able to find a modus operandi of peaceful coexistence will remain the most critical issue in the post-COVID-19 world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Yoon. I think with those excellent framing remarks, we can move over to Q&A. We are continuing to monitor the YouTube channel live, so please continue to send on your questions here. Professor Na, the first question goes to you. This is a question coming from Young Ning. This is related to soft power. Young asks, while China is unlikely to overtake the United States due to COVID-19 alone, what do you think about the impact of US's withdrawal from global leadership in this crisis on its soft power?
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. My view is that Trump and his withdrawal from international institutions had already had a negative effect on American soft power, and you can see this in technical polls. Poll.
So we seem to be experiencing a little more on the technical difficulties with Professor Nai. I'm going to switch and we'll return to Professor Nai. But Professor Yoon, Minister Yoon, if I could ask you a question. This is an alliance question related to how things are playing out in the region. And the question is, how do you think the US's response and lack of global leadership to the COVID crisis will affect the US's alliances?
I think one of the characteristics of President Trump's foreign policy is a transactional approach, and that approach seems to be actively applied in dealing with alliance issues. And that made political leaders in U.S. allies in the world, not just for Asian allies, more uncertain about the future direction of their alliances, and they are somewhat, concerned about the current state of the alliance relationship with the United States. We want, some kind of more emphasis on the value of common ideologies, or like a democracy and market principle, and the value of international coordination and international cooperation and institutions in dealing with global issues very much. So how we can manage bilateral as well as global issues with more sound and strong alliance relationship at this time of turbulent period of transition. That's the key concerns of political leaders in every country. South Korea has important bilateral issues with the United States, like denuclearization of North Korea, or some defense budget sharing issues, or some other cooperation issues. But I think too much transactional approach will not benefit. Will not strengthen our bilateral alliance relationship. And I hope U.S. policymakers pay more attention to that aspect.
Thank you, Professor Yoon. Professor Nai, I just wanted to restate the question again. I think the connection is better now. The question was, while China is unlikely to overtake the United States due to COVID-19 alone, what do you think about the impact of the U.S.'s withdrawal from global leadership in this crisis on its soft power?
Well, I think the U.S. has definitely damaged itself, reduced its soft power. There was already a reduction in American soft power as a result of President Trump's downgrading of alliances and institutions. But I think this has been accentuated. So I think the American response has been what the proverbial shooting oneself in the foot. If you look at how China responded to the World Health Organization and how the U.S. has responded to the World Health Organization, it's clear that that's a case where Xi Jinping was more agile than Donald Trump.
Thank you, Professor Nai. Minister Yoon, the next question is for you. Question starts with, as a former foreign minister, what procedures and institutions tend to be the most effective in addressing fast-moving, complex, transnational challenges? In these urgent moments, who do you turn to?
I think the role of international organizations and transnational institutions in dealing with very complex global issues is very important. But I think the importance of those international organizations has been underestimated at this moment of world politics, and that is, lamentable. However, I think at this time of a leadership vacuum, the U.S. government doesn't seem to be interested in exercising global leadership in dealing with global issues like environmental issues or some other pandemic issues like that. I think the role of middle powers may be more important than before. And there may be some Asian countries like South Korea, of course, and Japan, and in Europe, France, Germany, and in America, Canada, or Australia. All those countries probably would be able to exercise more influence and more leadership in trying to resolve global issues, including pandemic issues as well. But again, I think the leadership role of the U.S. will be important. But when the interest on the leadership role of U.S. has been weakened in the United States, there may be more room. There should be more room for middle power countries, and also I would like to pay attention to the role of a global civil society. intellectuals and eminent intellectuals and business leaders or NGO leaders may somehow gather together and try to make a common plan of action in dealing with some specific issues like pandemic or environmental issues, etc. So I think it's time for us to expect more role from the middle power countries as well as international, civil society.
Great. Thank you. Building on that question, Professor Nai, this is a question related to morals of leaders. We've seen a range of responses from national leaders. You've written your new book, Do Morals Matter? What is the role of morals for leaders as they deal with COVID-19?
Well, I think that, the issue of morality is not a simple one of either or. It's very much, as I said, how one defines the national interest. You can either take a broad view or a narrow view. And here, I'm very much in agreement with what Prime Minister Yoon said. The U.S. has recently taken a too narrow transactional view. But if you go back historically and you look at something like the market plan, you can define your interests narrowly. We'll make sure in 1948 that the Europeans pay us back loans we gave during the war, or you could say we're going to transfer 2% American GDP to help Europe recover. Well, that was good for the Europeans, but it was good for the U.S. too. So the moral component came in there in terms of how we defined our national interests. We missed an enormous opportunity. Southern half of them were simply not paying attention to the science. So if we actually help poor countries cope with their COVID problems, then we are helping ourselves as well as helping them. That's an example of a moral choice which we failed to make. But it's not too late. If there are going to be second and third waves of the pandemic, one could hope that that leaders would see the importance of we're all in this together. After all, a virus doesn't care at all about the nationality of the human being that it kills, and maybe we're going to have to learn something from that.
Thank you, Professor Nai. Our next question, Professor Minister Yoon, is related to case studies here. At the Kennedy School, particularly the Belfer Center, we look a lot at applied history. The question is, what are good historical case studies for navigating through COVID-19 from your perspective?
I'm not a specialist of pandemic, but I think, as Professor Nai already mentioned in his remarks, the case of Spanish and flu in 1918, I think would provide important implications and lessons for us in dealing with similar pandemic these days. Also, I think in case of South Korea, we could be somewhat, successful in dealing with COVID-19 as the result of some time-taking, process of learning since MERS pandemic several years ago. So there should be some kind of, continuous effort to upgrade your system with which you can deal with this kind of pandemics. And I think also in dealing with this kind of COVID-19 crisis, we need to go back to how we are doing in terms of allocating our national budget, or national energy, in dealing with this kind of public, disease. For example, how to allocate, national financial resources between private medical field, which focuses on curing some specific disease on the one hand, and public health system, which would focus on this kind of dealing with this kind of pandemics. I think that is important. If you do not pour some certain amount of financial resources to the public medical sector, you will have very difficult problems in dealing with this kind of challenges. And all this issue is related to what kind of capitalist system you have. If you put public health sector wholly to the private investment or private profit making, I think that will not be desirable for the whole public. So balancing that kind of investment and strengthening public sector in medical field to some extent, I think that is important part. Though I'm not a specialist of health problems or pandemic problems, I think that issue, in other words, allocating financial resources in your country between those two, private sector and public sector in medical area, I think that is important.
Thank you. I'll turn to my last question, and Professor Nye, this question comes from Marshall Murillo. It's related to regional blocks, and he poses a question. What are the crucial roles that regional blocks might play to mitigate consequences of this potentially fundamental transformation?
I think we may see some increase in regionalism as countries begin to shorten their supply chains to reduce vulnerability. In other words, there are a number of people who have said that we don't want to be dependent on masks from China or Asia, but we would be willing to have them come from, let's say, Mexico or Canada. So that's an example where the effects of the COVID virus may change the preferences between global supply chains to regional supply chains. The other key question is going to be see what happens in Europe. First reactions in Europe by the European Union were not very successful. They didn't work together as a unit very well. But more recently, Macron and Angela Merkel proposed a major fund which would help to bridge the South gap within Europe. And that's true, and we're able to show that on a regional basis, it had been able to cooperate in ways that people thought it was failing in the first month or two of the coronavirus. that would again strengthen the reputation of regional organizations. So both for economic reasons about less vulnerability in supply chains, and for political reasons, if the Europeans show that their regional institutions are able to respond effectively, which at first it didn't look like they were, but now may be changing, those I think would indicate that there'll be some increase in regionalism as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Though again, I go back to my point that I made right at the beginning about humility. At this stage, we're so early in the crisis that we really are speculating. We don't really know how to project the future.
Great, thank you very much. My deep thanks to Minister Yoon and Professor Nai for providing great context and framing comments for our event today. I just wanted to mention to our viewers here, with a lot of the telecommuting and greater use of broadband and internet connection in the United States, it's very patchy at best. We will be putting together a report, and a lot of the key comments and highlights that our speakers have mentioned will go into that report. So please keep an eye out for that. Some of the points that didn't come out too clearly on the audio, we did capture for the report. My deep thanks again to Professor Nai and Minister Yoon. At this stage, we're going to move over now to panel 2 and looking at the geoeconomic implications of COVID-19 on global governance. In looking at this topic, I wanted to start off with setting the scene here for geoeconomics. To flatten the curve and tame the global spread of COVID-19, national authorities like the US government have implemented what economist Jason Furman has called a medically induced coma of their economies. We have a unique opportunity to explore the major policy questions confronting government and business leaders as they adapt to a host of rapidly evolving challenges and opportunities. Our two speakers for panel 2 will first start off with Professor Lee Jae-min of Seoul National University at the School of Law there. He has had a distinguished career looking at the intersection of international law, international public law, international investment law, and international trade law. And on top of that, he is a practitioner as a former diplomat and also an expert for Korea at the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement and the Korea-Europe Free Trade Agreement. Our second speaker will be Dr. Christopher Smart, who was most recently a senior fellow with the Center for Business Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is a unique example for us in terms of the combination of serving at very high levels at the White House, National Economic Council, National Security Council, as a special assistant to the president, looking at these type of financial and economic matters. He, during that time, had dealt with the European crisis, financial crisis. So a number of lessons learned from that time period as well. He is currently head strategist at Barings Investment Institute, where he leads the efforts looking at a lot of the macroeconomic issues that we'll be going into a deep dive examination here for panel 2. Let me turn it over, and first starting off with Professor Lee. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. John Bak. I'd like to thank President of Korea Foundation, Dr. Lee Geun, and also the Executive Director, Aditi Kumar of Belfer Foundation for this opportunity. I'll just follow up on the economic implication, geoeconomic implication of COVID-19. And I would like to briefly talk about what this would mean for the global trading regime, investment regime briefly, and then I'd like to conclude with what this would mean for the Korea-United States bilateral trade relationship. Again, this is an unprecedented event, and nobody has thought about this pandemic. So I would say perhaps no country is prepared for this type of event. And many countries are just scrambling to respond to the daily operations of the pandemic. Many countries have adopted restrictive trade measures, and many countries are exploring emergency plans in the economic sectors, including Korea and the United States, as well with many other countries. And while they are now busy the emergency measures to scramble the unfolding situation. At the same time, they are now looking at what this would mean for the structural reformulation of the international economic regime, international trade regime for the future. Well, again, this could not have come at the worst time. Well, we have been witnessing already for several years, we have been witnessing already China-US, US-China trade disputes, and we are witnessing the surge of global protectionism, not just one country, but the spread of protectionism here and there, and restrictive measures by many countries here and there in many sectors. And also, we are looking at the problem of the weakening or erosion of the multilateralism, or the erosion of the leadership of the WTO. So combining the three, US-China dispute, the erosion of the multilateralism, and the surge of protectionism, at least in terms of the international economic sector, we have already hit the lowest point after the inception of the GATT in 1947. And all of a sudden, in 2020, we are now having COVID-19 and its unprecedented impact on the economies of many countries. Well, as has been already mentioned by previous speakers, I think the current situation of pandemic, well, these problems, the COVID-19 has not created new problems, but I think the advent of COVID-19, the occurrence of COVID-19 has amplified or sharpened or perhaps crystallized the existing problems that we have been already struggling with. Again, the G2 confrontation and the protectionism and the weakening of multilateralism. So the COVID-19 has sharpened and crystallized the existing problems that we are already struggling with at the moment. Well, at the same time, COVID-19 has also raised another layer of complexity and another layer of new issues, which is first of all, which is the importance of the digitalization or digital economy generally, and the second one is the putting many issues into the perspective of national security concept. Let me get back to that point soon. And the third one is the unraveling or reformulation of the global value chain. So we are already having the fundamental problems that we are struggling with, but at the same time, we are now having new problems with the advent of COVID-19. The first one is digitalization of the trading system or the advent of digital trade, and how to deal with the new types of global value chain, or how to formulate new global value chain in the aftermath of the COVID-19, and how to deal with countries and states' concern over national security. Now national security is playing out in many different angles. Not just the military concept, but from the commercial aspect, and now from the health aspect. Now we have to put the existing trade agreements, existing investment agreements, and existing international conventions from the new perspective of national security. So these new layers of complexities and these new layers of homeworks are making the preparation and dealing with the pandemic more difficult than several months ago. So, well, while we are struggling with these new challenges, together with the existing challenges, but at the same time, perhaps we can find some silver lining here. Again, maybe this COVID-19 has forced us to contemplate a formulation of a new trading regime and new norms of global trade, starting with the global value chain and digital trade, and how to reflect countries' concern in the newer environment of international community. Well, we have been already discussing new trading norms and new investment norms in many different categories of instruments. And now international community is now faced with this homework and these tasks to find newer norms and to formulate the newer norms in the face of the new pandemic. So maybe this is a good opportunity for many countries to look into these issues from a different angle and from the different set of mandates, and try to find some compromising ground and to look into the future trading norms and investment norms for the changed environment. So this situation is now bringing us into a new universe of international trading regime, and at the same time, for the time being, we are expecting the increased tension between the United States and China in the economic sector, which means that many countries who are trading with China and trading with the United States extensively will find themselves in a difficult situation to position themselves in a balanced way between the two states. But that said, I think while we are faced with unprecedented situation with many difficult tasks, old and new, but at the same time, it's a good opportunity for us to look into deeper into the existing trading norm and to reflect the concerns of many countries, particularly the concerns of the United States and perhaps concerns of other countries, so that we can come up with a different set of rules to regulate future trading norms, more importantly for digital trade as well. It is not a secret, again, that the United States is not so satisfied or happy with the current multilateral trading regime. And now it is not a secret that the analog norms of trade agreements are not responsive to or reflective of the faster changes of digital economy. It could be digital personal information, it could be computer server localization requirement, it could be, again, your concept of national security. All these issues are now upfront on the table. So this could be a good opportunity for us to look into the real matter of the international trading regime of today, not the issues that we first heard about this issue back in 1947, 73 years ago. But now, in a different environment, in a different context, now we are forced to look into these matters and confront these matters up front and try to find some newer solution for the future trading regime. It may not be a full liberalized trade as we have hoped, or as we had hoped before, but at least we could find some manageable or some compromised version of trading norms and investment norms or regulatory norms on the global level that could responsive to the interest of many countries. More importantly, the long-term interest of the United States and long-term interest of countries like Korea and perhaps interest of China as well. I think in this different environment and change the landscape, now we could think about these issues from a different angle. And we could find some compromised settlement basis from which we can consider newer concept of a trading regime for the future. So on the one hand, this 2020 COVID-19 pandemic is a global disaster that we should overcome very soon, hopefully. But at the same time, now this is an opportunity for the leaders like the United States and China, or exporting the power countries like the EU, Japan, or Korea could sit together and talk about these issues from scratch and find some common ground for a reliable, not best, but reliable and manageable solution for the future. So with that, I think this is a very challenging moment, but hopefully we could contain the situation and manage the situation so that this global pandemic does not go to extreme in terms of economic sanction or economic negative economic restrictions in a negative way. So we'll have to see, and we'll have to find a workable roadmap to ride out this pandemic for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. I think with that very interesting connection to Professor Nai's comment about pre-existing trends prior to COVID-19 playing out. In this instance, the changes and transformations related to the international trading regime. And on that theme and related themes, I turn now to Dr. Smart. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you to our hosts at the Korea Foundation and the Belfer Center. For me, this has been a very interesting conversation to listen to, and I hope I can add one or 2 points, although I find myself in agreement with a lot of what has been said already. First of all, I think to our Korean colleagues, John is far too diplomatic, but I just want to apologize on behalf of the United States for our technological infrastructure. Sooner or later, we will catch up with Korea, and these kinds of calls will be flawless in the years ahead, I feel sure. But I did want to start with the point that others have made, that obviously the threat to globalization is not something new. It is not something that with the arrival of COVID-19, we are suddenly experiencing these doubts and these questions about the progress of globalization. When I was working in the Obama administration, we were actually working on, as you know, a fairly ambitious trade agenda, a particularly ambitious trade agenda for a Democratic president. But it built on work that had been done in the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, and there was a vision, arguably an unintentional vision, but it was a coalescence of forces and timing that led to our working on both a major trade agreement with Asia, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as you know, and a major trade agreement with the European Union, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. I cannot claim to be the author of the acronyms for these, but it was terribly confusing for those of us even working on it day to day. But anyway, that was a vision that had the United States at the center of a free trade area that would encompass almost 2/3 of the global economy. We hoped it would be setting standards and raising standards and integrating economies and not excluding countries like China, but serving as a benchmark that China would in some ways over time be able to raise its game, raise its standards, and ultimately become a part of. Clearly, that is a vision that is under threat, has been under threat for the last few years, not just in the United States, but we've seen it also in Europe and elsewhere. And I think the conventional wisdom now is that COVID, because it has forced some unfortunate retrenchment, both in terms of literally shutting down flights among countries, but also I think some very unfortunate knee-jerk reactions of shutting down trade in medical equipment, hoarding of medical equipment within borders in order to make sure one's own people's needs were met. Those kinds of things didn't last long, but I think it was clearly not the best reaction in the crisis. But even though I think the conventional wisdom is that the globalization is under threat, or it has been its demise has been accelerated, I think it's important to remember that there are at least 3 heroes of this crisis that we may ignore at our peril. First of all, scientific cooperation has, if anything, accelerated. Maybe the United States has not joined with the European Union officially, but certainly the 24 companies working on finding a vaccine, working on new testing regimes, even though many of them, there's a disproportionate number of them that have headquarters and offices within 2 T-stops of the Kennedy School, they depend on research teams spread out around the world, and that cooperation, I think, is certain to continue. Secondly, calls like this one remind us that it's not just Zoom, but it is our interdependence and our ability to talk to one another that technology has made possible, and the ability going forward to distribute new business models around technology where physical presence is not necessarily required. I shudder to think how much this phone call would have cost between Cambridge and Seoul when I was in college. But we're essentially able to do it for free with a large audience and mostly seamlessly. And I think those kinds of, that sort of infrastructure had already been driving businesses to the advantages of cloud storage, the advantages that we're increasingly seeing in artificial intelligence. And those are things that will drive globalization rather than, they will not tolerate a reversal of globalization. Maybe I should put it that way. And the third hero of the crisis, I would say modestly, is actually the US dollar. It is resented increasingly in many parts of the world, and yet, once again, when the going got tough, markets flocked into the US dollar, into dollar assets. If many of us may be a little dismayed by the behavior of our State Department in terms of leading the global community in a response to this crisis, I think we can be proud of the United States Federal Reserve, unintentionally perhaps, but and certainly not a role that he sought, but Jerome Powell in supplying swap lines to major central bank counterparties, in a very creative response for emerging markets to provide a repurchasing facility for many economies that had treasuries in their assets but needed dollars to supply local markets. He and the Fed were there to help stabilize markets. And I think as much as countries may not have intended it or wanted it, one of the great ironies of this crisis, I think, is that the global economy has emerged with an even greater dependence on the dollar. And the lesson for any foreign finance minister or central bank governor is that you don't get fired for having too many dollars in your reserves. You don't get into trouble when the next crisis hits. And I think that will certainly continue. It is clear that there is going to be some changes in our trade agenda. Obviously, it will be smaller. It will be more difficult. We will have bilateral agreements, maybe with the UK, although I'm not holding my breath on that one. Clearly, any of us who've dealt with trade issues in the past, the dread call from the Trade Representative's office that a certain agreement had been hung up over sanitary and phytosanitary standards, which most of us don't fully understand, but is always the breakdown in most progress and most negotiations. In any case, those health concerns are likely to be more accentuated and more difficult moving forward. And it's just also hard to imagine great progress on the US-China front. I'm not so sure that we're going to see a lot more trade retaliation in the near term just because both countries are reeling from this crisis. But clearly the tension is escalating in other areas around technology, around Asian security issues, and in particular around events developing this week in Hong Kong. And once Congress gets into the act, that will make things even more complicated for that relationship. But, and it's also clear if on the trade and the political side, we're going to see changes in the economy, there will be a dramatic reshaping of certain sectors, whether it's travel, leisure, retail, the way we shop, the way we take vacations, the way we shape business models, as I mentioned before, will change because I think companies will have learned that this forced experiment actually has led to some long-term gains and will change some habits. We've seen Facebook announce quite dramatically that it expects half of its workers globally to be working from home over the next 5 years. And that has very important implications for commercial real estate, commuting, transportation, urban infrastructure, and the like. But having said that, I just generally come from a school, having been a history major long ago in college, that plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The changes that we do see tend to be more incremental than sudden. There is change, it is permanent over a longer period of time, but I suspect after this is done, we will go back to both political patterns and economic patterns that we were dealing with before the coronavirus crisis. As Professor Nye pointed out, the United States and China will not trade positions, certainly in terms of their military power, will not trade positions, certainly in terms of their economic strength. Americans will still want to shop and travel, because that is, I think it's in the Bill of Rights, or if it's not, people seem to think it is. But trade will grow marginally more complicated. Businesses will have to learn to deal with the risk of tariffs being threatened and imposed. And as we have said, it is not just, President Trump has made tariffs, I think, acceptable in polite company, the way they weren't before his administration. But I think if Vice President Biden, is elected, it will be hard for him to at least withhold the threat of tariffs. And certainly, I think it will not all be sweetness and light in the U.S.-China trade relationship under a Democratic administration either. Of course, as Professor Nye points out, we should all have some humility in terms of our predictions. But I don't think we will see a massive reshoring of production of supply chains. Supply chains will become more expensive, perhaps, because there will be backup needed. Supply chains may move out of China because of concerns about that relationship, but they won't necessarily move back home. They will move, as they were already moving, to Vietnam or South Asia or other parts of the world. And I think it will require markets, but I think markets will still force companies to buy their inputs from the lowest cost, best quality provider. And those won't necessarily be in Wisconsin. And global trade will continue, global interdependence will continue, and it will, as I say, in spite of political headwinds, be reinforced by some of the dynamics that technology, medical science, and as I pointed out earlier, I think financial markets will require. So let me pause on that, and I look forward to the conversation and the questions. John?
Thanks very much, Dr. Smart. Great remarks there. A lot to build on. The first question that we have is this particular question, definitely coming out swinging here. It's a supply chain question. And to both speakers, Professor Lee and Dr. Smart, the question is this. The State Department is reportedly pushing to remove global supply chains from China and to create an alliance of trusted partners called the Economic Prosperity Network, EPN. Would this mean the reemergence of competing blocs in the long run? And should South Korea take part in this new EPN with its traditional allies? Starting with Professor Lee.
Thank you, John. Yes, I think now the discussion of economic prosperity network is the item that is starting to change the concept of global value chain and the participants of global value chain. And again, that would put countries like Korea or Japan or many countries in this part of the world in a very difficult situation. But at the same time, I think, again, as I said in my presentation, now the global value chain is not simply about finding cheaper sources of raw materials or parts. Now that global value chain concept is including the concept of the geopolitical issues as well, including the alliance issue and other diplomatic issues as well. So that said, I think the new concept of GVC will probably further deepen the fragmentation of the global trading system in balkanization and fragmentation through many different blocks. So unfortunately, that seems to be the way that we are heading. At least that will be the system, that will be the situation that we'll have to deal with, at least for the time being. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And the question to you, Dr. Smart.
Well, maybe I'm a little more optimistic or maybe a little more skeptical of the power of the State Department, but EPN strikes me as an acronym that is unlikely to outlive this administration. And the State Department's ability to reshape global supply chains significantly strikes me as a great deal of hubris at this stage. Obviously, there are important elements in the national security supply chain in terms of export controls that has been in place for a long time. It will continue to be an important part of U.S. policy to make sure that key elements of our national security infrastructure, and particularly around telecommunications, and that's why we're having these issues with Huawei, those will be defined, those will likely be expanded, and those will likely be much more difficult for companies to navigate in that telecommunications, weapon-related, defense-related set of sectors. But I'm not sure it's reasonable to expect either markets or companies to, without adding a tremendous cost to their business models, dramatically change and divide the world into blocks. And I just don't see that as something that is likely to as I say, happen or expand beyond a few key sectors where much of that is already in place.
Thank you. The next question is related to international institutions. This question comes from Aaron Rabena. And the question is this: with the growing mistrust on China and the WHO, with the WTO unable to mediate in the US-China trade war, how do you see the functionality of international regimes going forward? If I could start with Dr. Smart this time.
Well, I think, as I learned in graduate school, international regimes have always had a hard time. And I think they tend to rise and peak and sputter because they bring together common interests in important ways. They ultimately, fail to achieve the soaring heights for which the founders ultimately hoped, whether that's the United Nations, whether that is, I don't want to go down a NATO path, but I think we all hope for better for a lot of these organizations, and they face rough waters, and clearly these are rough waters for the likes of the WTO or the WHO. But again, I think it comes back to those who call for the abolition of the WTO, and we've got a leading voice in the Senate right now who is calling for that. But trade will continue, and it will need to be regulated, and we'll have to have some group or something to regulate it, and we'll have to recreate something that will be called, maybe it won't be called the WTO, but it will look a lot like the WTO. I think the same is true for the WHO. There are flaws that frankly, I didn't know much about its origins or its work. But clearly, the calls to withdraw support, I think at this time, don't make a lot of sense. All of them need some reform. All of them could use some additional reinforcement, I think, because their missions are still critical. So that's a long way of saying, I guess, sure, there will be bumpy waters ahead for these organizations, but I'm, again, more optimistic about their future than pessimistic.
Great, thank you. And turning now, Professor Lee.
Thank you, John. I think the current situation of COVID-19 has laid bare the contributions and also significant limitations of international organizations as well, most notably WHO, as we all know, and also WTO as well. So again, they are contributing a lot to the global effort to fight the COVID-19 all over the world. But at the same time, we are witnessing the inherent limitations of these international organizations. Perhaps these are not the faults of these organizations, but the way they are structured is maybe the real problem of their limitations. For instance, again, the WHO is only focused on, naturally, on global health issue, while WTO is on trade issue. And collaboration between the two entities are not formulated in a way that could respond to the type of emergency that we are facing right now. So it's like of international organization operating in each silo, like each state is operating in its own silo. So while on the national level we have to find a way to increase our collaboration among states, but at the same time, at the level of international organizations, we should also think about a way to connect the different international organizations or to energize their collaboration among themselves, at least in a situation where the whole global community is in danger. So that's something that we can consider for our future contemplation of the international organization regime. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is specifically to Dr. Smart, and it's a currency question. Do you think countries will be inclined to reduce reliance on the US dollar through Fed, though the Fed has showed flexibility with repo facility, swaps were not extended to major economies like China and Russia?
So swaps were not extended to major economies like China and Russia, but the repo facility was, and I think that was probably more important for those markets, and it was a better tool to respond to the needs of China and Russia. Clearly, there's a great and rising frustration among countries like Russia in particular, but others with the way we have deployed our financial sanctions in some ways. When financial sanctions were deployed on behalf of global goals, whether it was to crack down on drug kingpins or terrorists, or even we developed over many years, but cooperation around isolating the Iranian regime that ultimately produced the agreement that President Obama helped or led the negotiation for, and that the Trump administration has withdrawn from, the JCPOA. That withdrawal has led to resentment in Europe, and Europe has tried to create some trade mechanism that would be able to trade with Iran without touching the US dollar financial system. So that resentment is building, and nothing lasts forever. Having said that, the dollar is so entrenched in the global financial system that even countries that don't like us and resent us are forced to accumulate dollars because markets want to accumulate dollars. And again, these kinds of things can change. They have changed. Obviously, the sterling was the dominant currency at the beginning of the last century. But it requires, it's not something that governments can do to force. It is a question of building up confidence in that currency over a long period of time. I've done a lot of thinking about this, so I can go on at great length, but I won't. What I would say, just to conclude this answer, is that the alternatives to the dollar, the euro, for example, obviously the backing of the euro is the family of countries behind it, and it's clearly not, except for this week, a very happy family. And I think nobody looks at themselves in the mirror in the morning and says, boy, when things get tough, I'm going to put all of my money into this story. The renminbi, the Chinese government has worked very hard to raise its usage in international markets and has had some success from a very low base. But again, the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure, the regulatory infrastructure inside China has not so far created a debt market that investors feel comfortable if I need to park money in a storm, I can put it all into renminbi and pretty quickly I'll be able to get it back. And that is the ultimate test that in spite of all of our problems around the dollar and our behavior with the dollar, I think the dollar for the foreseeable future will be the currency of choice for most markets.
Great. I'd like to conclude with a big question to both of you. This is a question that I think is in the forefront of a lot of thinking right now, irrespective of where we are geographically. And that pertains to challenges to global governance going forward, specifically with respect to the trade-off of balancing public health priorities on one side and economic priorities on the other. If you look at it globally, we can essentially group countries in one of two categories. One, the group of countries that have essentially been able to manage and deal with COVID-19 while keeping their economies running. And the second group of countries that have essentially shut down their economies as they try to tame COVID-19 and are now looking or in the early stages of reopening. So the question to both speakers, how will government and business leaders balance these public health priorities with the need to restart the economy for this, the second group, or for those economies still running, how they're able to manage it? And so the specific question is, what are viable models or practices that you've observed that can be helpful in managing these two very difficult goals at the same time? Starting with Professor Yi, and we'll wrap up with Dr. Smart. Professor Yi?
Well, John, that's a very difficult question. Again, it's still very unpredictable how these things will play out. But once we overcome the current situation, now the next question is how to resume or restart or revive the trading system, the trading activity with with other countries. Well, I think, again, according to your two categories of countries, two groups of countries, I think countries will place a great deal of emphasis on the level of preparedness or the level of regulatory screening, to put it that way, that could be relied upon. And then with those countries, perhaps countries will try to expand or resume or normalize trading activities at a faster speed. But with the countries in the second category, or countries where the economic systems are still in the mode of shutdown or in the mode of unclear status, I think it will take time for the normalization of trading activity. So, but over time, if the global community overcomes the current situation, then we can go back to the normalized trading activity. But until that time, I think countries will be very cautious or very selective or very picky in selecting or prioritizing their trading partners, particularly in key sectors. Thank you.
Thank you. And with the final response there to Dr. Smart.
Well, I wish I had a little more time to stall and think of a better answer, because it's a very complicated question, as Professor Lee points out. I think but of course, those of us who invest in financial markets like to have an opinion on everything. But what I would say, it's probably too soon to make a judgment as to which model, which countries succeeded better than others. As we said earlier, we don't even fully understand the disease, let alone how to respond to the disease appropriately. The debate is obviously increased the polarization within the United States, such that the wearing of face masks has now become a political act, weirdly. But I think, it's really a question where the extremes are clear. It's the middle ground that is much less clear. In the extremes, obviously, until you restore confidence in daily patterns of activity, going to the store, getting on an airplane, booking a hotel room, that activity will not return to normal. And so getting the disease under control remains the top priority before you start reopening activity. At the other extreme, clearly, there is risk in everything in life. There is risk of a traffic accident or another disease taking you down. You can't reduce coronavirus cases to zero before you restore activity. And that is the difficult line that political leaders are walking right now, some obviously better than others. But I think that will be the current path forward, which is that, we will be reopening our economies around the world at different paces. There will be flare-ups in different parts of the world, in different parts of cities, which will lead to reactions. But we're unlikely, I think, to lock down the global economy to sort of induce the coma that Jason Furman describes, again, barring a bizarre mutation that the disease starts attacking a different sector of the population that we never understood or never expected. So that is why I think you're seeing both activity resume as well as financial markets racing back, not necessarily because they expect everything to be better all at once, that it will be a V-shaped recovery, but that this quarter, the next quarter, the third quarter will be better than the second quarter, the fourth quarter will be better than the third quarter, and next year, 2021, will be better than 2020. And so I think that is the current path that markets are seeing and pricing in as different political models, different political leaders navigate the two extremes between the lockdown and the complete restoration of activity.
That was great. I was wondering if we would be able to somehow highlight some upbeat notes, and that's perfect timing. So thank you very much, Dr. Smart. I'll move now to wrapping up, and I just wanted to thank first off our participants on the YouTube channel. This was fantastic for both the audiences in South Korea, where it's quite late in the evening and quite early in the morning on the US side. And also, we have a number of participants joining us from other international regions as well. Thank you all for joining us. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be writing up the highlights from our event today with some links to what the speakers have written recently. So this is going to be a framing type of document to keep this discussion going. The second, thank the partners, the Korea Foundation and Harvard Belfer Center, the great way of this partnership as an example to bring us together in real time, but also to bring together our respective networks and communities. Special thanks to KF President Dr. Egan and Executive Director of Belfer Center Aditi Kumar for joining us. And also wanted to thank the KF technical team in putting this all together, the fine balance between Zoom and YouTube, making it run very smoothly, and specifically to Tu Hyunji and her team. And then finally, and very importantly, to our speakers, Professor Nai, former Foreign Minister Yoon, Professor Lee Jae-min, and Dr. Christopher Smart. Greatly appreciate sharing your insights today. And I want to also just finally note, for our next event, we'll have a very active summer for both KF and Belfer Center in terms of our series of events coming up. And so please keep an eye out and follow us on Twitter. The first is @Korea Foundation, and the second one to follow is @Belfer Center. And with that, I wish you all good health, and we look forward to reconnecting very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.